A Gravedigger's Christmas, written by Chris Fritchie. Chapter 1. Stuck. The Big Buck Diner. The window rattled as the North Dakota winds pelted it with heavy snow. Fulton warmed his fingers holding a cup of soup as he looked out the window and sighed. "We never got snow like this back home," he said. Wesson stared at the tall floodlights wobbling in the gusts. Their intense light was reduced to hazy, glowing orbs. "They should have been back by now," she said. "Monkhouse, check the mechanic's shop." "Huh?" said Monkhouse through a mouthful of crackers. "It's freezing out there." "Yes. That happens with snow. Find Top and Ross. See if they need help with anything." "They're fine," said Monkhouse, stalling. "This whole rest stop is walled off. They have guards in the towers. Besides, if there's any Vicks out there, they're frozen." "Vicks, Pops," smiled Fulton. "Did it sound like I was asking, Sergeant?" said Wesson. "I'll go," said Oda. Monkhouse cheered up, patting Oda on the shoulder. "I owe you," he said. "Again," said Oda, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You don't have to go," said Wesson. Oda shrugged. The conversation paused, interrupted when they overheard the angry voice of the manager, Dale, coming from the kitchen. It stopped when a waitress scurried out of the kitchen door with Dale, flush-faced, behind her. He stood by the cash register as the waitress came up to the team's table. "Everything okay, June?" asked Monkhouse. "I'm fine," she said with a strained smile. "You folks need anything else?" "Thanks," said Wesson. "I think we're okay." June's green eyes flicked to the other end of the diner where Dale stared at them. "I'm really sorry, but the boss doesn't want you sleeping here anymore," said June. "Here they come," said Fulton, pointing out the window. Two figures emerged from the storm, knee-deep in snow, leaning against the biting wind. They entered the foyer under the glowering disapproval of Dale. Tate and Ross stomped the snow off their feet and brushed off their coats. Dale opened his mouth, ready to deliver his eviction speech as the two men entered the diner. "Hey, you," started Dale. "Us?" asked Tate as he took off his coat. Dale's gaze fell to the tomahawk and holstered Colt .45 on Tate's belt. The manager's mouth hung slack for a moment before closing his mouth, and he disappeared behind the kitchen's double doors. "That's what I thought," smirked Ross. "Take it easy," said Tate. "We have been here for a while." "Yeah, sorry," said Ross. They walked to the other end of the diner and joined the rest of the team, who looked at them expectantly. "It doesn't sound good," said Tate. "You boys look like icicles," said June. "Coffee?" "You're the best," grinned Monkhouse. "She was talking to us," said Ross. "I'll get you boys a couple of cups," said June, smiling back at Monkhouse. He watched her as she left, a wistful smile on his face. "What's the situation?" asked Wesson. Tate shook his head unhappily. "The bus isn't going anywhere soon. The mechanic says the parts he needs are on the other side of this snowstorm, and the roads are buried. It'll be a week before they can get through." "When we bought our bus tickets," said Monkhouse, "they told us it was VIX-proof." "Yes," said Wesson, "but they didn't say anything about steel bridges and giant spikes." Chapter 2. No one's home. 5 days earlier, the big Greyhound bus lumbered down the remnants of Interstate 94. Years of neglect, rain, ice, and overgrowth had turned parts of it into more of an obstacle course than a highway. A few of the towns that depended on shipments would put together road crews to repair the worst of the damage, but that meant going outside the walls. That was Vic's territory. Tate and the team had been on the road for days. December had brought a harsh cold front, and the irony of wanting to be back in the hot jungle wasn't lost on any of them. The last mission was a success right up until their ride home crashed, nose first, into the landing strip. Lucky for them, they were warming up inside the terminal instead of waiting outside next to the bags stacked up at the edge of the landing strip. The plane slammed into the tarmac, throwing flaming fuel everywhere, turning their gear into a bonfire. The pilot, who had a history of flying while drunk, did not survive. The only money the team had left was in Tate's backpack, which he carried everywhere. Everyone had spent the first part of their bus ride angry at the delay getting home and the incineration of the Christmas gifts they'd bought themselves. "A brand new compass," said Monkhouse. "Not like that army antique they issued me. It was beautiful." "That was beautiful?" moaned Fulton. "Did you even see my custom holster?" "No," said Monkhouse, "but I smelled burning leather." "I think that was the sheath of my hunting knife," frowned Wesson. "Not to be insensitive," grumbled Ross. "But you will," said Wesson. "I'm out 4 months' pay," said Ross. "Original riot gear arm guards cooked into little puddles of plastic. That really hurts." "I thought that was Oda's bow," said Fulton. "That thing was sleek." "You're probably not going to find—" The dreary look on Oda's face made Fulton realize he wasn't making things better. "Sorry, Oda." "We can't even drown our sorrows," said Monkhouse. "Top lost a full bottle of— what was it?" 10-year-old whiskey, said Tate. "What a shame. You'll never get that back," mused Ross. "No, I won't," said Tate, forcing a smile. "Thanks for pointing that out." The round robin of misery eventually died into sullen silence. In time, even that gave over to boredom. There was little to do except stare out the window at the passing snow-covered landscape or sleep. Mile after mile and hour after hour in the confines of the bus was making everyone edgy. Fortunately, there were several empty seats, and Tate separated them to reduce arguments. Monkhouse's head lolled to the side, softly snoring after a sleepless night. The heater in the bus had gone on the fritz, and his meager blanket couldn't keep away the chill that was shivering him. His chair bumped and he jolted awake, wondering if they'd run over another Vicks. The back of his seat bumped again. "I swear," said Monkhouse, turning around with a scowl, "if you kick my seat one more time, I'm going to lose my mind." "I can't help it," said Ross, squirming for a comfortable position. "These chairs are like sitting on bricks. My legs are killing me and my butt's numb." "If your butt was numb, you'd be slurring your words," sneered Monkhouse. "Are you saying I'm talking out of my—" "Both of you zip it," growled Wesson. "One word out of either of you and you'll be walking home." Fuming, Monkhouse turned around. His seat bumped again and he spun around, but Ross waved him off. "It wasn't me," he said. "Ladies and gentlemen," called the bus driver, "as you might have just felt, we're turning off the main highway for our next stop at Whitetail. We'll be in town for an hour. You can get something to eat, freshen up, and they even have hot showers. Just remember to be back before we leave." An old man who'd spent the trip sitting in the back of the bus got up and started for the front. The bus rocked from a pothole, knocking the old man against Fulton, who quickly grabbed him by his heavy coat to steady him. "Apologies, son," said the man. "Either the roads are getting worse or I'm losing my sea legs." "It's okay," said Fulton. The old man reached the front of the bus and looked out of the large windshield as the town of Whitetail came into view. The driver's face drooped and the old man's hands tightened on the grab bar. Pillars of black smoke rose into the cold blue sky from behind the protective walls of the town. Chapter 3. Armor Up. "I think you better stop here, Jerry," said the old man, putting his hand on the driver's shoulder. "Okay, Nick," said the driver. Tate had sensed something was wrong from the old man's body language and joined them as the bus came to a stop just short of the small girder bridge that spanned a frozen gully. The bus sat idling 100 yards from the town as white plumes of exhaust slowly evaporated in the brilliant sun. Tate pointed to the binoculars sitting on the dashboard. "Can I borrow those?" he asked. Jerry handed them over. Tate scanned the wall but didn't see any activity. "One of the gates is slightly open," he said. "I don't see anything else." "It's quiet," said Nick. Wesson joined them and Tate handed her the binoculars. "Do they have a bunker?" she asked. "No," said Jerry. "We should check for survivors," said Tate. Jerry craned around to look at Tate, worry visibly etched in his face. "Out there?" he asked. "Maybe just roll up a little closer," offered Nick. The driver hesitated a beat before putting the bus in gear and easing it forward. The bridge popped and groaned as the big motor coach rolled across it, but took the weight easily. With the bridge behind them, they drove a short distance before the bus squeaked to a stop. There were still no signs of life. "A couple of us can quietly go up and check it out," said Wesson. "Or?" asked Tate. "Or we could honk," offered Nick. "If anyone's hiding, tell them we're here." "Look," said Jerry, pointing. 3 people broke from the front of the gates in a dead run, terror in their faces. Jerry pulled a lever and the bus doors opened. "Oh no," said Nick. They all saw it. A swarm of Vics charged out of the gate, racing after the survivors. Tate squeezed his eyes closed in pained resolve. He knew those people weren't going to make it. With incredible speed, the Vics ate up the distance. The survivors disappeared in a pile of seething carnage. "Those poor people," said Nick softly. "Jerry," said Tate, keeping emotion out of his voice, "it's time to back us out of here. Nice and quiet." Jerry's eyes were fixed, unblinking, on the incomprehensible horror as he closed the doors and shifted into reverse. The Vics paid no attention as the bus started backing away. Too late, Tate realized the driver wasn't watching where he was going. With a shriek of metal, the bus lurched to a stop when the rear bumper hit the arch of the bridge. Every head in the mass of Vics turned and looked at them. "Vics incoming," barked Wesson. Behind her, the rest of the team stood up, not sure what to do, but ready for whatever to do their part. The Vics charged. The driver sat, transfixed by the wave of Vics coming at them. "Jerry!" snapped Nick. Jerry shook his head and slapped a red button on the dash. The inside of the bus went dark as plates of ceramic weave shielding dropped in place over the windows. The only view outside was through the reinforced windshield. "Get us out of here," said Tate. Jerry hit the gas, but the bus didn't move. "We're hung up on the bridge," he screamed. "I can't back up." The road was narrow with drop-offs on either side. Any attempt to turn here would roll the bus. "The gas stop," yelled Nick. "It's just inside the town. There's enough room to turn the bus around there." "Who's going to open the gates?" asked Jerry. "Go through them," growled Tate. "But," said the driver. "Go!" shouted Wesson. Jerry jumped like he'd been bitten, threw the bus into gear, and gunned it. The Greyhound charged forward, the engine rising from a growl. The Vics and the bus slammed into each other in a gruesome collision. The shell of the bus reverberated with the impact of flesh and bone, and it gouged a furrow through the swarm. "Hang on!" yelled Jerry as the town gate filled the windshield. The bus hit it like a battering ram, shattering through the gate and shearing off the Greyhound's armored brush guard. Timber and plywood flew out of the way, revealing the remains of the town in ruins. "There," said Wesson, pointing to the large dirt lot by the gas stop. "Turn us around there." "I see it," said Jerry, his voice quivering. The bus hurtled past scorched buildings, some nothing but piles of black debris, but very few bodies. Most of them were attacking the bus. Monkhouse's gaze was pulled in several directions at the sounds of pounding fists on the skin of the bus. "They're on us," he yelled. "They ain't getting through that plating," shouted Jerry. "Now everyone, hang on." They rolled into the wide dirt lot meant for freight trucks to park, and Jerry pulled on the big steering wheel, cutting the bus into a hard left. Tires screamed, throwing up sheets of powdered snow. The bus leaned over at a frightening angle, threatening to roll over, then righted itself. Vics threw themselves at the Greyhound, armored or not, the sound of their snarls everywhere. Jerry got the bus pointed back to where they'd rammed their way in. The shattered remains of the gates bristled from their twisted hinges. Seeing salvation ahead, Jerry hammered the gas. Ota cocked his head, seeing slivers of light wink across Monkhouse's shoulder. Suddenly, sunlight flooded in as a Vix ripped the plating off a window. Monkhouse hardly had time to react as the thing smashed through, grabbing him by the back of the collar and pulling. Yanked off balance, Monkhouse stumbled back towards its mangled face and gaping jaws. Ota flung himself at Monkhouse, knocking him down as the Vix bit down on empty air. Quick and powerful, the thing crawled through the window to reach the 2 men below. "Hey!" shouted Ross, and the Vix fixed him in its milky, dead eyes. With a grunt, Ross swung a fire extinguisher with all his might. The metal cylinder hit with pulverizing force, splattering putrid bits of flesh everywhere. Monkhouse and Ota scrambled out of the way, and Rossa kicked the mangled torso out of the window. The bus hurtled towards their only way out, but as they got closer it was clear the bus wouldn't fit between the long, ragged timbers jutting out from the edges of the shattered gates. "We can't make it through that," shouted Jerry, taking his foot off the gas. "It's that or die," said Tate, and shoved his boot down on Jerry's foot. The bus leaped forward. Tate could feel Jerry trying to pull his foot away as they raced at the jagged spikes waiting to impale them. "Down!" cried Wesson, pulling Nick to the floor and covering him with her body as Jerry let loose with a wail of panic. Tate yanked him to the floor and dropped an instant before they hit. The windshield exploded inward as two thick timbers speared through above their heads. The 20-ton bullet hardly slowed down. The large beams ripped away the roof before tumbling off the back of the bus. The windshield and roof of the cab were gone, and cold air gushed in, sucking the warmth out of everyone. Tate pulled himself into the driver's seat just as the front right tire went off the edge of the road, touching only air. He pulled on the wheel and the bus rocked back on course. The steering was sloppy now, wanting to dash unexpectedly, left or right. They were a long way from safe, and Tate mashed the gas pedal. The bridge was coming fast. A single lane wide, the thick steel girders would not be forgiving. Fighting the wheel, Tate tried to straighten out as the bus juked side to side. Biting cold wind stabbed his eyes, but he refused to blink. He threaded the bus onto the bridge, solid steel beams whooshing past. The others picked themselves up, shards of glass and wood falling off them. All of them watched the gaping hole where the roof used to be, expecting to see the rictus grin of a Vix appear, but none ever came. "The gate must have scraped them off," said Wesson. "Happy accident," chuckled Tate, not knowing if he was shaking from fear or relief. Chapter 4. Out of options. The Big Buck Diner. "It ain't all bad news," said Ross as he thawed his hands under his armpits. "We bumped into a freight driver in the garage. He's having problems with his rig, but if the mechanic fixes it tonight, we can grab a ride in the trailer." The bell over the door jangled as a bundled figure came in. Fulton recognized him as the old man from the bus from his long, thick coat and fur-lined cap. He took off his cap as he walked over to June, who greeted him with a smile. Fulton couldn't hear them, but it appeared the man wasn't a stranger. She made him a cup of cocoa, and he bobbed his head in appreciation. They chatted briefly while he sipped his drink, and he then walked to a family seated nearby. He fiddled with his cap as he spoke to them. He must have asked them something because they shook their heads with an air of apology. He thanked them and moved on to the next table of diners. "If the truck driver doesn't work out," said Monkhouse, "is there any good news from the motel?" "They're booked solid," sighed Tate. "It's the same story everywhere. Everyone inside isn't getting out, and everyone outside isn't getting in." "I think the manager wants us out," said Wesson. "June was going to tell us just before you came in." "What's his problem?" scoffed Ross. "I'll talk to him," said Tate. "We're sleeping on the floor," said Monkhouse. "What's wrong with that?" "Here you go," said June, putting down fresh cups of coffee. "We were just talking about your boss," said Tate. "Dale?" said June. "He's okay. Kind of prissy about his restaurant." "Do you know anywhere else we could stay?" "Maybe there's room at your place?" asked Monkhouse. "Sergeant," snapped Wesson, shutting him down. "Oh, I got a tiny home," smiled June, flushing pink. "Sorry." "It's fine," said Wesson, and the scolding did nothing to take the smile off of Monkhouse's face. Across the driveway, the lights of a big rig lit up. The rumble of the big engine shook the piled snow off the cab, and the driver revved the engine. "Hey," said Ross, "there's our ride." Throwing on the coats, everyone headed to the door, with waves and goodbyes to June. As Tate reached for the door, the old man scurried after them. "Hello again," said Nick. "Some adventure on that bus, eh?" "Hi," said Tate. "Sorry to cut this short, but we're getting a ride out of here." "Oh," said Nick, looking anxious. "Well, that's good news." He followed them into the storm, trying to keep up with them. "You see," he said, "I have a load of supplies for the folks in Reed's Corner." "Working on Christmas Eve?" said Ross. "That's rough." Yes, actually, said Nick, walking beside them. Quite rough. They met up with the truck driver at the back of the trailer. This everyone? He asked, his face barely visible under the scarf wrapped around his head. Yes, said Tate. Well, said Nick, the thing is, the people who were going to help me deliver the supplies were in Whitetail. Oh, I'm sorry, said Wesson, climbing into the trailer. Yes, very tragic, said Nick, watching Fulton getting into the trailer. So you see, I was wondering... You getting in, Pops? Asked the driver. Me? Said Nick. Oh, no. The truck driver shrugged and swung the left door closed on the trailer. At any rate, said Nick, could you people help me deliver my supplies? I'm sorry, said Tate, but we have to go. I hope you can find someone to help you. I understand, smiled the old man, but the disappointment was clear in his eyes. Thank you anyway. Have a safe... The truck driver closed the right door, shutting the team inside the trailer. There was complete darkness inside the trailer. They couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. All they had was the rumble of the truck's engine and the moan of the wind. Well, sighed Tate, the good news is we won't be sleeping on the diner floor tonight. How long before we reach the next stop? Asked Fulton. A few days, said Tate. I know what you're thinking. This is starting to feel like a bad idea. 4 days of sitting on a hard floor in complete darkness in an uninsulated metal box? Said Monkhouse. How is that a bad idea? The air brakes spat as the driver released them, and the truck lurched forward, causing everyone in the trailer to knock into each other. And I thought the bus seat was hard, groused Ross. The truck bucked to a stop with the sound of grinding gears. Anyone else thinking being locked in a steel box with no doorknob on our side, sitting in the dark, might just be the dumbest thing we ever did? Asked Ross. The sound of someone outside, swearing, traveled along the length of the trailer. A moment later, flurries of snow whipped inside as the driver pulled open the door. Pressure line just snapped, said the driver. What's that mean? Asked Fulton. It means we're back to square one, said Tate. They shuffled to the edge of the trailer, and there was Nick standing where they'd left him. Tate leaned out and looked over at the diner in time to see Dale glaring back at him. A moment later, all the lights in the Big Buck diner were switched off. I heard you need some help with supplies, smiled Tate. Nick smiled up at him. Chapter 5. Traveling in Style. The wind died off, transforming the pelting snow to gentle, falling flakes as they followed Nick around to the back of the motel. This used to be a train station back in the day, said Nick. Then it was a saloon, house of ill repute, and now a motel. Suddenly, I don't feel bad about sleeping on the diner floor, said Wesson. To their wonderment, they saw a classic old-fashioned train sitting beside a covered platform. Brass pipes ran the length of the glossy black boiler from the red-painted cab to the tall chimney in front. The spoke drive wheels looked strong and heavy. This looks like it should be in a museum, said Tate as steam hissed from the front wheels. Not this one, said Nick, climbing into the cab. Me and her go back a long way. This is how we're getting the supplies to Reed's Corner? Asked Monkhouse, a big smile creasing his face. You want to help me run her? Asked Nick. Monkhouse was in the cab before Nick finished the question. You all can warm up in the passenger car, said Nick, thumbing at the car behind the engine. She's about up to temperature, so we'll be leaving as soon as you're aboard. The rest of the team gratefully stepped into the warmth of the passenger car. The interior was handsomely paneled in varnished wood and had brass lights on the ceiling. The green leather seats had pull-out footrests, which Tate wasted no time in stretching out on. I should have been born in the olden days, sighed Ross, easing himself into a comfortable seat. In the cab, Monkhouse looked at the controls with happy interest. These gauges tell me how she's doing, said Nick, pointing to the digital displays on the control panel. These brass levers control speed, brake, and steam pressure. It really runs on steam? Asked Monkhouse. People have been using steam for hundreds of years, said Nick. You don't need to depend on electricity or gasoline, just heat and water. All right then, go on and push that brake lever by your head and we'll get going. Monkhouse was only too happy and pushed the lever. Nick pulled another lever, and the sound of hissing steam grew louder. "Here we go." A small tremor shook the cab as the engine put power to the spoked drive wheels, and they began to pull away from the platform. He pressed one of the buttons on the control panel as they neared the high defensive wall that ringed the rest stop. "Times being what they are," said Nick, "I had to give the old girl some teeth." A panel on the front of the engine slid open and twin .50 caliber machine guns extended out on rails. "Going outside the wall can be a little tricky," said Nick. He pressed another button and powerful motors rolled a portion of the defensive wall out of the way. "See here?" said Nick, pointing to a display. "Each gun has motion sensors tuned to pick up Vicks." "That's impressive," said Monkhouse. "How did you get a hold of those?" "I know some boys who are good with their hands." Nick tapped an imaging monitor showing a 180-degree field of view in front of the train. "Looks clear," he said, satisfied. The train gathered speed, and soon they cleared the wall which closed behind them. Monkhouse could feel the heat coming from the firebox. "This used coal to heat the boiler, didn't it?" he asked. "Used to," said Nick. "Coal's hard to come by, so I had to get creative." "What are you using?" asked Monkhouse. "It's hot." "It ought to," chuckled Nick. "I got a small nuclear reactor in there." Monkhouse's face went pale, and he looked at the glow from the fire door like it was going to bite him. "Nuclear?" "Oh, not what you're thinking," said Nick. "Well, partly what you're thinking, but trust me, it's safe." Monkhouse didn't look convinced. "It's got more shielding than it needs to," said Nick. "I've been doing this for a long time, and I haven't started glowing in the dark yet. You can always join your friends in the back." Monkhouse considered it, but felt better about being in the cab after Nick explained the shielding. The train was up to speed now, and the snowy landscape drifted by in a blanket of bluish white. Everyone had found comfortable spots to relax in the soothing warmth of the passenger car after laying their coats out to dry. "This is working out pretty good," said Fulton with a yawn as the train gently swayed. "Yeah, but this ain't a pleasure cruise," said Ross. "The work part hasn't started yet." "That old man's been doing this without much help," said Wesson. "I don't think there'll be a lot for us to do." Oda contented himself with looking out the window. Tate woke up and discovered everyone else asleep. Outside, the clouds had cleared, revealing a magnificent star-filled sky. The moon shone with a brilliant silver light, making the landscape otherworldly. They were climbing higher into the mountains, and he could hear the engine laboring to pull them up the tracks. It wasn't long before they leveled off and picked up speed. The open scenery closed in as they wound their way into a narrow valley. Tall mountains crowded in on either side, and Tate craned his head to see the peaks of the mountains high above. Chapter 6. Tombstones. Nick moved a lever, and the train began slowing. "What's wrong?" asked Monkhouse, sensing Nick become tense. "Just about there," said Nick. "The town," said Monkhouse. "That was quicker than I thought." "No, just the end of the line," said Nick. "The track doesn't go through to the town anymore. It got wrecked in a landslide years back. I'm going to radio the town and let them know we're on our way." He pulled a radio out of his coat and switched it on. "Climb around to the passenger car and tell your friends we'll be stopping soon." Monkhouse reached for the cab door, not looking forward to the cold again, but Nick stopped him. "Let them know they have to be real quiet," said Nick. "No loud sounds." "Why?" asked Monkhouse. There was no smile on Nick's face as he stared at Monkhouse for a moment. "This place is a little dangerous." Frowning, Monkhouse opened the door and stepped out onto the metal catwalk, and followed it to the passenger car. Nick shut down the engine and disengaged the gears, letting the train's momentum carry them forward. The train rolled quietly to a stop exactly where Nick had planned. He glanced out of the window, studying the world outside, before opening the door and climbing down the ladder into the snow. He met the others as they came out of the passenger car and stood quietly, taking in their surroundings. Tate went over to Nick and spoke quietly in his ear. "What's going on?" "This part of the forest is dangerous," said Nick. "We'll be fine as long as we're quiet. I done this for years and never had a problem." Tate regarded the old man. His lined and weathered face looked tense, but there was no panic or fear in his eyes. "My truck's over there," said Nick, pointing to a gray shape in the snow. "I could use the boys' help with the truck if you folks can start moving the supplies." Tate waved Fulton over, and Nick smiled and shook his hand before leading him to the truck. Fulton recognized the no-nonsense military surplus truck right away. 10 feet high and 25 feet long, the 5-ton 939 hunched in the snowdrift like a hulking rhino. The double rear axles sported 2 sets of wide, knobby tires that came up to Fulton's chest as Nick led him around to the back. Together they reached over their heads and unlatched the drop gate of the cargo bed and quietly eased it down. Nick climbed up into the covered cargo area and switched on an overhead light. "We might need these if the tires can't break out of the snow," said Nick, and he started passing Fulton picks, shovels, and pry bars. A mist began rolling in as Oda and Monkhouse arrived with a stack of boxes in their arms and pushed them onto the truck bed. "Oh, heck," said Nick. "I forgot to tell you, there's a box marked fuel cells. The town's likely low on power, if not out by now. Be sure to bring those boxes next." "Okay," said Monkhouse, and he left for another load. Nick climbed down as Tate showed up with more supplies, and Nick helped him struggle them up onto the truck bed. "I'm going to warm up the engine," said Nick. Tate looked at him with surprise. "Warm up?" he said. "This runs on gas?" "Diesel mostly," said Nick, patting the big saddle tank. "But it'll run on just about anything that'll burn. There's a fella that drives a fuel truck who comes by every few months. He always sneaks me a few gallons on his way to the big city." Tate looked at the rugged mountains looming high above them. "You picked the right truck to get through territory like this," said Tate. Nick waded through the snow and climbed up into the cab of the truck, softly closing the door behind him as Tate made another trip to the flat car. Rosse, Wesson, and Oda grunted as they muscled through the snow with a large wooden crate. Fulton met them to help and grabbed a corner as they tried to lift it up to the truck bed. "Easy," puffed Rosse. "Almost there." Wood clunked and scraped as they got one end of the crate on the bed. Everyone crowded at the other end, struggling to push the crate in. It started to move when Wesson's foot got tangled with someone else's, and she tripped. Reaching out to stop her fall, her hand banged into the tools that were leaned against the truck's fender. The quiet was shaken with clashing metal tools that clanged like a box of pots and pans. Wide-eyed, Nick jumped out of the truck and raced over to the accident, red-faced and panting. "I'm sorry," started Wesson. "Shh," hissed Nick, cutting her off. He stood motionless, listening. Everyone else froze in place, doing the same, but not sure what they were listening for. They heard the random muffled shush of snow falling off evergreen branches. Nothing else. All of them glanced from the forest to Nick, waiting to see what he'd do next. He began to relax, and the others, taking their cue from him, breathed a sigh of relief. "Wait," said Oda, holding up his hand. Somewhere in the mist they heard the whisper of moving snow. Fulton silently pointed to where he heard it. Monkhouse pointed in another direction, hearing the same sound. Her eyes wide and searching, Wesson didn't look away from the woods as she slowly reached down for the fallen crowbar. "What the—" started Ross, as a short mound grew out of the snow in front of him. "Get in the truck, Nick," whispered Wesson. Snow hissed as more and more mounds appeared around them. Soon they were surrounded by a field of snowy tombstones. Tossing the crowbar to Ross, Wesson grabbed a shovel. Ross readied his crowbar as clumps of snow fell off the nearest mound, revealing a pale, twisted face. A baleful eye glowered at Ross from under lank red hair, crusted with ice. Their hesitation was over. Chapter 7. Close Quarters. Rossi swung the steel bar, hitting the Vicks, sending snow flying off. The Vicks staggered but grabbed onto the crowbar with a snarl like cracking glass. It began to pull itself to Ross, who reared back and kicked it in the face. Bone and brittle flesh shattered, and the limp corpse fell back, swallowed by the snow. Grabbing the other tools, the team attacked as Vicks grew out of the white drifts. Even as they beat back the ones close by, gray shadows took form in the distance as more Vicks stiffly lumbered towards them. Their number quickly grew, and the team suddenly realized they were being pushed back, almost shoulder to shoulder. "Help!" Fulton yelped when a Vicks latched onto his arm. He desperately shook his hand as the Vicks snapped again and again at the moving target. A blur whistled past his face as Wesson shattered the Vicks's shoulder. It stumbled back with a growling sputter and came at them again. With a grunt, Fulton brought down his pickaxe, smashing through its head and chest, its legs buckling under the force. The heavy tools and frigid air were sapping the team's strength. Too soon, the best they could do was push the Vicks back. Ross was holding his own, his powerful arms landing devastating blows, but his chest was heaving as he gasped for breath. He was nearing his limit. His arms, like lead monkhouse, couldn't fend off the Vicks that snatched at him with greedy hunger. Its frozen fingers, like daggers, whipped out at him and scraped his face with a vicious swipe. "I got you," said Tate, charging in. He slammed into the thing with a body blow, knocking it back into the snow. "Everyone into the truck!" he yelled. Two more Vicks came at Fulton, who could barely hold up the pickaxe. "Get to the truck," echoed Wesson, moving between Fulton and the Vicks. She hit the first Vicks, snapping its neck and making it, if possible, more grotesque as its head lolled from side to side as came at her. Strain pulled the cords in Wesson's neck as she dug for her last ounce of strength. Using her crowbar as a spear, she lunged, plunging it through the Vicks's chest. The blunt chisel of the bar cracked its spine. Bone and skin creaked as the monster folded over on itself. A terrible laugh escaped Wesson, overcome by the insane horror of it all. She was slammed back into reality when the second Vicks hit. Hands lashing out, it sunk its frozen fingers into her side. Jolts of pain shot through her. Her scream of pain was cut short when she was thrown against the side of the truck by the charging Vicks. Its desiccated face filled her vision as it thrust its gaping jaws at her. Shards of teeth split off as its jaws crashed together, clacking and snapping at her. Wesson swung with her free hand, catching the thing in the side of the head with her fist. Bone and frost splintered, staggering it, but it came back for her. Teeth snapped inches from her face. She hit again, hearing bone crack. The Vic stumbled, letting go. With a cry of anger, Wesson knocked away its arm, grabbing it by the back of the head. Sidestepping, she violently pulled, smashing its head into the solid steel of the truck. Tate appeared next to her and propped her up. Holding her side, she grunted in pain as he helped her to the back of the truck. Ota and Ross leaned down and grabbed her, pulling her inside. "We got you," said Ross, seeing the blood seeping between her fingers. "Nick," called Tate, "we have to—" Gnarled hands reached up through the snow and pulled Tate under. "Top," yelled Fulton, jumping out of the truck. He flailed at the snow, trying to find Tate. Snow fell into Tate's face as he tried to fight an enemy he couldn't see. Something heavy, creaking, was crawling on top of him. He fought to swing his tomahawk, but thick snow robbed it of any use. Icy flakes of snow stung his eyes. He desperately blinked because he could feel his attacker clamber onto his chest, but couldn't see it. Shaking his head, Tate cleared his eyes in time to see the frost-speckled face of the Vix, just as it chomped down on his belly. Yellow, black teeth closed on his thick coat, and it thrashed its head side to side, trying to rip him open. Letting go of his tomahawk, Tate pulled open the flap on his holster. His numb fingers hardly felt the icy-cold frame of his Colt .45. The Vix let go and reared back for another bite. It lunged down right onto the barrel of the Colt. Snow, bone, and slop vomited out of the snow as Tate blew out the back of its head. The thing slumped across his chest. An instant later, Ota and Fulton pulled him out and to his feet. "Check his legs," said Ota as they both examined him for bites. Two more Vics staggered towards them. The .45 boomed twice, demolishing them, while shadows of more appeared in the distant mist. Nick ran at Tate, face pale and taut with fear, and waved his hands. "What did you do?" he said, almost pleading. I said quiet. "A little late for that," scoffed Tate, holstering his gun. "I wasn't talking about them," said Nick, nodding to the dead Vix. "What then?" "Hush," said Nick, going still and listening. The others listened with him with a nervous eye on the approaching Vix. "All I hear is the wind." said Wesson. Nick looked into her face with dread. That ain't wind. Chapter 8. Shelter. The sound of rushing grew in volume and bits of snow began dropping from tree branches. Nick took off to the front of the truck. Get in if you want to live, he yelled over his shoulder. There's supplies on the train, said Tate, but the words were hardly out of his mouth when the sound of wind rose to the roar of a freight train. Nick yanked the gear shift into first and slammed the gas pedal. The truck growled, trying to shoulder its way through the snow. Grab onto something, yelled Nick and reached for a red switch on the dash. Tate dove for the retreating truck, sure he was going to miss, but Ross's hands caught him by the scruff of his coat and hauled him just in time. Nick flipped the switch, throwing power to the supercharger under the hood. The engine roared with a punch of sudden horsepower and shot forward. The big 939 plowed through snowbanks, throwing up a wave of white as the tires clawed the ground. A titanic wall of snow charged down from the mountain, towering above them, pounding the earth and snapping trees like twigs. The air was noise and chaos and rising as the avalanche raced down at them. Everyone hang on, yelled Tate, bracing for the gut-wrenching impact. To their disbelief, the truck stopped, ending any chance of escape. Someone screamed, but nobody heard it over the deafening roar as snow crashed over them, flinging everyone around like leaves in a hurricane. Darkness swallowed them as mayhem shook them senseless. An instant later, there was nothing but deathly silence. Around him, Tate heard the moans of others in the blackness. His head swimming, he tried to gather his wits. Everyone stay still, he said. Feel if anything's broken before moving. Everything feels broken, groaned Monkhouse. The dome light flickered on, revealing a tangle of bodies and boxes. The pass-through to the cab slid open and Nick's grinning face appeared in the opening. That was a heck of a thing, he chuckled. Everyone okay back there? I want to go home, said Monkhouse. How are we still alive? Asked Tate. We made it under the eve of Old Woman Rock, said Nick. Almost didn't make it this time. Tate looked at him, uncomprehending. This time? He slumped back, feeling utterly drained. I need a minute. Can you drive us out of this? Asked Fulton, looking at the wall of snow blocking their way out of the truck bed. Nick glanced at the rigid roof of the truck bed and smiled. I doubt it, he said, and wriggled into the jumbled truck bed. But the roof hasn't caved in, so we're not buried very deep. Let's get all this mess squared away, eh? Together, they helped the others out from under the boxes of supplies. There were several sprains and bruises, but no broken bones. They cleared an area for Ross to look at Wesson's wounds. It looks worse than it is, said Ross, spraying the 3 ugly gouges with an antibiotic. Then it must look frickin' horrible, flinched Wesson, because it feels like he ripped me open. That spray'll deaden the pain, said Ross, covering the wound with a bandage. Here, said Nick, appearing with a cup in his hand. I got a thermos in the cab. Have as much as you want. Wesson cupped her hands around the mug, inhaling the aroma of coffee. You're a lifesaver, she smiled. After everyone had rested and worked out their sore limbs, they got started digging their way out. Taking turns, they tunneled out of the back of the truck to the surface. The entire landscape had changed, submerged under a sea of white. Nick ran the engine until a plume of exhaust melted through the snow, signaling where they should begin digging. It was wet and cold work, but slowly they were able to move enough for the truck to struggle through and break free. Exhausted, the low growl and swaying of the truck rocked them to sleep as Nick navigated the road to the town. Chapter 9. Christmas Magic. They woke up to the hiss of air brakes as the truck lumbered to a stop. We're here, said Nick when Tate stuck his head into the cab. Through the windshield, they saw the high patchwork walls of the town. There were no lights or signs of guards on the wall, making Tate wonder if they were about to get a repeat of the attack at Whitetail. Looks deserted, said Tate. They must have run out of power, said Nick. Everyone's inside trying not to freeze to death. I'll get the gate open and you can bring the truck in. Nick climbed out and headed to the wall as Tate got into the driver's seat. He watched as Nick felt around the wall until he found a hidden latch. A small door opened, and Nick disappeared inside. A moment later, a section of the wall rolled out of the way and Tate drove inside. Nick waved him to a stop just past the gate and closed it behind them. Inside, everything was silent and still. Homes and buildings, illuminated in the silver-blue moonlight, formed a large semicircle that ringed the desolate town square. Their dark windows felt like pitiless eyes staring down on them. "You can put the supplies down by that tree," said Nick, pointing to a lone, tall evergreen in the town center. "Over here's the power room," said Nick as Ross, Ota, and Tate muscled the crate of fuel cells. He led them to a single-story brick building while the others stacked boxes by the tree. Propping up his flashlight, Nick opened the cylinders on the dormant power generator. One by one, they took out the used cells and slid in fresh ones. Ross latched the last cylinder closed and brushed the dust off his hands. "Anyone know the time?" asked Nick. 0200, said Tate. Nick looked at him quizzically. 2 a.m., said Ross. "Well then," smiled Nick, "how about we give these folks a nice Christmas morning?" He threw the switch to the generator's grid and it started to hum. Status lights flickered on as the power increased until it reached full capacity. "You want to do the honors?" offered Nick. "It's up to you two," said Tate. Ota smiled and gestured to Ross. "Thanks, guys," he said, and pulled the main switch. The rest of the team were waiting by the supplies when lights sprang to life on the big pine tree. The tree lit the square in twinkling reds, greens, and golds. Everyone marveled in wonder at the impressive sight when the warm glow of light appeared from the homes, spilling out of their windows. Tate, Ota, and Ross joined the others as Nick trotted past them to a circle of stone in the middle of the square. He struck a match and tossed it into the circle. Flickering orange embers appeared and grew to flames, and soon a lively bonfire was crackling. The team gathered closer, sighing in the spreading warmth. "Hello!" shouted Nick as people came out of their homes. Welcoming voices called back as the square filled up with townsfolk. Before they knew it, the team was surrounded by warm greetings, pats on the back, and friendly handshakes of gratitude. The square was all happy activity. Large pots were set near the fire, and before long mugs of spiced cider, hot chocolate, coffee, and warm rum were being passed around. Although they were welcome into the celebration, the gravediggers felt like they were intruding and subconsciously drifted to the edge of the festivities. Bundled in coats and blankets, the townsfolk sat around the fire as the mayor climbed onto a low bench. "Traditionally, it's my pleasure to preside over our Christmas gift-giving," said the mayor, "but this year I'm going to pass the honor to Nick." Nick was contently puffing on his pipe and tried to wave off the offer, but with the applause in agreement and some good-natured coaxing, Nick took his place on the bench. Nick put on his spectacles as the mayor handed him a gift list. He looked down his nose, scanning the list. Clearing his throat, Nick began calling off names. One by one, townspeople would go up, and the mayor would give them a gift. The gravediggers watched from a distance with warm drinks and smiles. "Ain't this something?" said Russ. "There's some things even the Vicks can't destroy," said Wesson. "I can't remember the last time I saw so many happy people together," said Monkhouse. "Of all of our missions," said Tate, "this is the one I'm most proud of." The others quietly agreed and settled in to watch the gift-giving. It slowly dawned on them that the crowd had gone quiet and were looking at the team. "Lori Wesson," called Nick. "Come on over." Taken aback, Wesson got up and walked through the smiling people, up to Nick. "You didn't think we'd forget about you, did you?" said Nick, grinning down on her. The mayor reached into the box of gifts and took out a hunting knife. "No," said Wesson, almost speechless. "I couldn't." "Sure you can," said the mayor. "Our blacksmith, Mark, made this specially for you." The handle was crafted of cream and brown antler, and polished brass guard winked in the flicker of the bonfire. Taking it out of the sheath revealed a blade rippled with black and silver Damascus steel. I stammered Wesson. "It's beautiful, thank you." "Brett Monkhouse," called Nick. Monkhouse made his way up and stood next to Wesson. The mayor unwrapped a wad of folded burlap and handed Monkhouse a compass. "Are you kidding me?" said Monkhouse, grinning from ear to ear. He opened the brushed metal lid and watched the needle swivel to the north. "This'll take all night," said Nick. "The rest of you come on up here." Once the team had gathered by Nick, he called their names, and the mayor gave each of them a gift from the town. Ota graciously accepted a satin-finished carbon fiber bow and quiver of arrows. Ross wasted no time buckling on a pair of tough leather bracers on his forearms. "I'd like to see a Vix try and chew through these," he guffed. Fulton couldn't stop saying, "Wow," as he strapped on his new gunslinger belt and holster. "Last," said Nick, "for Jack Tiller." Tate watched as the mayor took out a pewter flask with his initials engraved on it. "I can't take this," said Tate, feeling humbled. "Well, you better," said Nick. "They already scratched your initials on it." He unscrewed it and smelled the aroma of finely aged whiskey. "Thank you, everyone," said Tate, holding up the flask. The townspeople laughed and cheered as the mayor stepped back onto the bench. "It looks like the sun's about up," he said. "How about we get breakfast going?" Everyone got up, some lending a hand with breakfast, while others mingled and chatted. The gravediggers found a corner of the square to get out of the way and admire their gifts. Wesson moved next to Tate as he unscrewed the cap to his flask. "How did he know?" she asked. "About the gifts?" smiled Tate. "He was on the same bus as us. He must have heard us talking about what we lost at the airfield. When we agreed to help, he radioed ahead to the town. Sorry, but it wasn't Christmas magic." "No," said Wesson. "I worked that part out, too." "So what's got you baffled?" "How did he know our names, especially yours?" Stammered Tate. He blinked at her, suddenly realizing Nick had called him Tiller. What were you saying about Christmas magic?" grinned Wesson. The end.
I hope you enjoyed A Gravedigger's Christmas. You can find the entire Gravediggers series on Amazon. Stay up to date with news about new books, promotions, and giveaways by following me on Facebook, Instagram, and Goodreads. A Gravedigger's Christmas by Chris Fritchie. Copyright C 2020 by Christopher Fritchie. All rights reserved. This book or parts thereof may not be reproduced in any form, stored in any retrieval system, or transmitted in any form by any means, electronic, mechanical, photocopy, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the publisher, except as provided by United States of America copyright law. Disclaimer. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.